Greetings once again from Mississippi, ladies and gentlemen. As a matter of fact, at this moment, though, I'm on an airplane traveling home to Sevier County from Jackson, Mississippi. I've just wrapped up this current 3-week engagement with the newest client. Not only was the change of scenery great from flat and brown West Texas to the rolling hills and greenery in abundance here in East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, but these teams that I and my fellow coaches have been working with, they're a bunch of fantastic guys. In all of my travels around the country and around the globe, there are very few people that I've encountered that work harder than the men here in the oil field. The crews that I have spent time with inside of the classroom and in the field made all of us feel welcome right away. All in all, it was a very productive and enjoyable, work-wise, 3-week engagement. Now I'm off to be home with my bride and to begin our final preparations for our trip to Greece, where we will trace the footsteps of the Apostle Paul. Speaking of which, I just want to remind everyone that there will not be any episodes released while I'm on this pilgrimage. Maybe a few social media posts or blog posts here and there, especially if there's any news about how our government works to spread their lies and erode our liberty in the process. To provide a bit of clarification on the podcast schedule, though, there will be a new episode released on the 13th of May, but no episodes on the 20th and 27th of May. There may be a Facebook Live on the Larry Linton for TN12 Facebook page for an event occurring the evening of May 30th, just a few days before the release of a new episode on the 3rd of June. Be sure and follow me on my social media to keep abreast not only with the show, but also the campaign. The links to my social media accounts are provided in the description of the episode on Rumble. For now, though, and as has been the norm for the past few months, I have to include this disclaimer with my podcast because it definitely relates to my campaign. So here it goes. The following content is approved by Larry Linton for TN12, candidate for the GOP nomination for Tennessee House of Representatives, District 12, Larry Linton, Treasurer. Now, without any further ado, let's get on with this week's episode of the Liberty, Leadership, and Lies podcast, where I break down the lie that there is a Republican supermajority in the Tennessee General Assembly. We'll do that by looking at some of the establishment GOP's greatest hits from the last legislative session. Get ready to enter the arena with me this week, folks, and here we go. Welcome to the Liberty, Leadership, and Lies podcast. On this show, we will discuss the assaults on our liberty by the very institution we the people created to secure our liberty. We will also compare and contrast the actions of people in leadership positions to the servant leadership that is needed to protect our God-given, constitutionally protected rights. Additionally, we will break down the many lies that elected and unelected officials in government and media spin every day in order to secure for themselves positions of power and influence that are antithetical to the system of government our founding fathers created and passed down to us. Your host on this program is Larry Linton, a 30-year veteran of the United States Navy who also runs his own leadership consulting company. He is also a candidate for the Republican Party's nomination to represent Tennessee's House District 12, which includes Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge, Pittman Center, Weirs Valley, Seymour, and parts of Sevierville, and most of Sevier County. So here is your host, Larry Linton. Again, folks, welcome to this week's show as we cover down on the topic of lies. I'm going to shift gears a bit for this beginning segment to discuss a lie that the national government has attempted to sell us. I'm doing this because this lie brings me back to the episode where I started coming out with a saying that our government hates us. You have to go back to episode 25 where I titled that week's show on lies with that very same phrase. Episode 25 was released on the 18th of August, 2021. For you longtime listeners, do you remember it? For the new listeners, what was the biggest news item of the day back in August of 2021? That's right. Dementia Joe's disastrous withdrawal plan out of Afghanistan that resulted in the completely unnecessary and preventable deaths of American military service members. In the years since that debacle, numerous studies by outside and inside of the government entities roundly placed the blame, rightfully so too, on the military leaders and their commander-in-chief at the time. President Truman's phrase of the buck stops here, highlighting a presidential accountability, must not be applicable to those presidents that suffer from severe declines in cognition, though. I only bring this up because of an article that came to my inbox the other day, actually, a bit more than 2 weeks ago. I had to leave it there and let my brain stew on it a bit before addressing the topic. Many of you know that I retired from the Navy in 2017, but I do still try to keep up with what's going on in my alma mater, so to speak. I do this by subscribing to several news sources, as well as keeping up with some of my fellow retirees, as well as friends that are still on active duty. The number of friends and contacts that I have are still on active duty is dwindling every day, though, as they start catching up to me in age. I refer to the U.S. Navy as my alma mater because that is the organization where I developed many of my life skills that I currently employ in my leadership coaching business, along with learning about serving my fellow Americans, in addition to gaining a lifelong respect and admiration for the country's Constitution and the men who wrote it. Anyway, the article came to me via one of the methods I use to keep up with the military. I believe I mentioned it before. It's called the Early Bird Brief. It's something like the Drudge Report used to be. It's an amalgamator of news articles. The first headline in my daily Early Bird Brief was this, quote, "Review says Abbey Gate bombing wasn't preventable," end quote. Very strange, don't you think? After all, just about everything written about that fiasco up until this point completely contradicts this latest news article. The byline for the article states it was written by Lolita C. Baldor and Famouche Amiri. I hope I got those names right, or I really don't hope, I don't care. Both of those with the Associated Press, though. That's a news organization that has proven itself to be a paragon of truth and unbiased news, right? The article points to an investigation conducted by U.S. Central Command. Now, that's the combatant commander responsible for U.S. military activity in the Middle East. You may remember them. They are the same command that initially killed a car filled with innocent people in the days that followed the worst overseas military debacle in the history of our republic. Yep, those same military commands or commanders and the commanding general that tried to distract and turn everybody in America's attention away from Biden and his disaster with the murder of innocent people, they are now trying to sell another lie to the American people. Now, isn't that just nifty? There are several things to consider with this article, though, folks. First, as I just pointed out, Biden and the military commanders of U.S. Central Command do not have a recent history of being truthful with us. The failed withdrawal, along with a drone strike that killed an innocent family, and now they're coming out with a story that contradicts a bunch of different earlier reporting, along with discounting the testimony of military eyewitnesses on the scene. But we almost must take into consideration the timing of this latest article. As I said, it came out 2 weeks ago, but that's right in the heat of Biden's reelection campaign. The same resident of the White House that is telling Americans he was raised in the Black community, the Jewish community, the Puerto Rican community, the Muslim community, that he drove an 18-wheeler, graduated at the top of his class, fought off a bad dude named Corn Pop, was arrested as a child for being a civil rights activist, that his uncle Bosie was eaten by cannibals, and on and on and on. He's a serial pathological liar, and now he and his generals, who, by the way, are too afraid to tell the emperor that he isn't wearing any clothes, they are telling the American people this lie. It's just another spit in the face of every service member that follows their oath to the Constitution. They are saying that the suicide bombing was unpreventable, meaning the loss of lives, both Americans and Afghanis, was completely unavoidable. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, not only does our government hate us, it also proves another point I made earlier this year. This administration has been building a military that will act against the citizens of this country. They will violate their oath to the Constitution and blindly follow the dementia-riddled kid sniffer in the White House or whoever's controlling him. They'll follow the rest of the executive branch of the government and the uniparty that is in control of the Congress. I'm going to take a break right here, folks, mainly because I have to calm myself down a little bit. We will get into the lie that we have a Republican supermajority in the Tennessee General Assembly on the other side of this short pause. Okay, folks, we're back for segment two. Before I move on, though, let's think about what I said in the previous segment for just a bit. Do a little root cause analysis of the situation we find ourselves in, so to speak. So, basic facts first. Joe Biden is a proven serial liar. That's the first fact. No matter how the media tries to spin it, the fact of the matter is that he spews lies every day and has done so since the beginning of his political career. It is not a case of that's just Joe being Joe. No, he tells lies because he is a narcissist. He has told them for so long without being held accountable for them by what is supposed to be an impartial press that he probably believes them as well. Once again, that's fact number one. Fact number two, nearly every single investigation into the Afghanistan withdrawal debacle, the worst foreign policy mistake in the history of our republic, nearly every single one of them has stated it was completely avoidable. Even government agencies have said this. When that fact is pointed out to President Biden, he tells us that we aren't reading the reports right, that he did nothing wrong, or he has even pivoted on a couple of occasions to blaming President Trump for the actions that occurred on Biden's watch while he was commander in chief of the armed forces. Now, fact number three, our military. At the order of the commander in chief and the commanding general and his staff at U.S. Central Command, murdered an innocent family in order to distract the American people from their terrible decisions on the Afghan withdrawal and the subsequent bombing at the Abbey Gate. Now, fact number four, this article is published at a time when the resident in chief of the White House is floundering in the polls while seeking reelection. It's almost as if the American people are no longer believing his many lies, so he has to put out a new one out there. He has to bolster his credentials. There are many other facts we could dig into as they relate to this situation, but we'll leave them for another day. I point out these facts for one reason only. Joe Biden has been in public office or around the periphery of government for more than 50 years now. He has never been held fully accountable for the consistent lies he has told over the course of those 5 decades, and people more powerful than him have noticed that, which gets to the heart of the matter, folks. Just how can such a serial liar be serving as president of the United States of America? Well, it's because of the apathy of the people of the United States of America. A majority of us have sat idly by while this incompetent fool kept getting reelected in the Senate, then elevated to the vice presidency, and now installed in the office of the president. The behind the scenes power players, call them what you want, the deep state, the administrative state, or whatever. They recognize that because of the electorate's apathy, they could put this guy into office where they know he would wreak havoc on our constitutional republic. Whether by enacting their initiatives and taking the blame for it, or through the enacting of his own bumbling initiatives. The goal was to completely destabilize our country and set the stage for another, much more tyrannical player to come on the scene. You know, they never counted on the disruptor that Donald Trump is and will continue to be. But the moral of the story is this: we can no longer sit on the sidelines anymore. We must throw nearly every single one of the people in elected office out and put into place true believers in the foundational principles of our constitutional republic. We need to completely revamp and get away with, fire, and rehire a complete new administration. We must enact our right to enforce term limits, not through legislation, but at the voting booth. We allowed this to happen, and we are the only ones that can stop it. While the opposition may have more money and resources to keep this train on the tracks to the ultimate destruction of our country, they do not have the one thing they really need: actual citizens showing up in the voting booth on election day. If more than 75% of the eligible registered voters show up on election day, there's no amount of fraud that can change what they voted for. We need to do our part, our duty and responsibility that comes with citizenship in our republic. We need to vote them out in the booth before we get to the point where we need to vote them out from bell towers and rooftops. That is something we need to avoid. All right, so enough on the national level for now. I apologize for coming that longer than I expected to. You all know how I feel about the Afghan withdrawal. Just gets my blood boiling, and talking about that on this podcast is a much better alternative to what I really want to do to those cowards, if you know what I mean. Speaking of cowards, we cover down on them now. I hope you've been following my social media posts for the past couple of weeks now. One of the biggest cowards we have here in Tennessee, now getting into any members of the General Assembly, is none other than the chairman of the Tennessee Republican Party, Mr. Scott Golden. I spent the past few weeks on this program highlighting the problem with Mr. Golden and his cowardly, weak, and toxic leadership as the head of the Tennessee GOP. As of right now, I've still not heard back from the voicemails and emails that I have sent to him and my state executive committee representatives. I mean, the event already happened, so we can't put the bullet back in the gun, so to speak, but no response at all, either way, is truly telling. I continue this theme in the next segment, but first, I ask you this question. What do most cowards have in common? Well, they all lie so they can protect themselves. So please stay tuned. We'll be right back after this break. All right, folks, we're back for the final full segment of the show. If you may have noticed, I'm trying to keep the full segments down to about 7 or 8 minutes now because I've noticed what would some would call mission creep. Gone a bit long in each segment the past few weeks, increasing the total length of the podcast to close to 40 or more minutes. That may be too much for some people, so I'm going to work on getting the most information out in as short of a segment as possible. So let's get into the real lie about our General Assembly is a supermajority Republican. You know, Gary Humble over at Tennessee Stands has a much more thorough breakdown of the last session of the General Assembly. So I'm just going to call out some key pieces of legislation and how they turned out to point to the fact that a Republican supermajority is just a term that is a facade maintained by both the General Assembly and the Tennessee Republican Party to placate the voting citizens of the volunteer state. So let's break down a few right here. For starters, we had Representative Lamberth, House Majority Leader, along with Senator Jack Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, introduced education freedom voucher scam legislation. While government education reform is a Republican issue, proposing to use taxpayer money to bribe citizens to purchase freedom from the government-controlled education system is a lie at best, a tyrannical takeover of the private education sector at worst. Thankfully, this bill was defeated. Rest assured, though, with the current crop of elected officials that are falsely labeled as Republicans, this bill will be attempted again next year. Next up is House Bill 1605 and Senate Bill 1722. This bill would have banned pride flags or any flag other than the U.S. and Tennessee flags from being displayed in government indoctrination or taxpayer-funded education centers in the state. This bill was killed in the Senate by Republicans refusing to vote, as well as Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally. He voted with the Democrats to kill the bill. We all know why Randy McNally would like to see pride flags flown in government classrooms all around the state now, don't we? Here's another gem, folks, that proves yet again we do not have a Republican supermajority in the General Assembly. What we have is a trans-Republican supermajority. House Bill 1948, Senate Bill 2350. This piece of legislation would have prohibited the use of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion practices at state-owned institutions of higher education, meaning taxpayer-funded institutions. That bill failed in the House Higher Education Subcommittee of Education Administration using the old reliable tool of the voice vote, so Republican voters are kept in the dark about which way their elected representative voted. Because of course, right? Now for the real doozy, House Bill 2260, Senate Bill 2119. This piece of legislation is completely antithetical to voting rights in our constitutional republic and in our state. This proposed piece of legislation would authorize LLCs or up to two members of an LLC that own a business in a city. It would grant them voting rights in that city, even if those members don't live in that city, but in a completely different district. Before we get into who introduced that bill, I would like to read what the Tennessee State Constitution states as it relates to voting here in the volunteer state. Article 4, Section 1 states, quote, every person being 18 years of age, being a citizen of the United States, being a resident of the state for a period of time as prescribed by the General Assembly, and being duly registered in the county of residence for a period of time prior to the date of any election as prescribed by the General Assembly, shall be entitled to vote in all federal, state, and local elections held in the county or district in which such person resides. All such requirements shall be equal and uniform across the state, and there shall be no other qualification attached to the right of suffrage, end quote. Notice the Constitution states person, not a business or corporation. Proposing legislation such as this in a standalone bill is an attempted end run around the Constitution. In other words, trying to amend the Constitution without going through the amendment process. The bill sponsors are learning from how the clowns in Washington, D.C. conduct business all the time in their artful lies to erode liberty, it seems, huh? Anyway, that bill was introduced in the House by Representative Dave Wright out of House District 19, which is part of Knox County. I'll give you one guess what political party he lists as belonging to. Yep, Republican. With Republicans like that in the General Assembly, who needs commies? Pieces of legislation like that would not just speed us up on the slippery slope, it would toss us over the cliff's edge into communist dystopia. The companion bill in the Senate was introduced by a real gem of an example of a trans publican as well, Becky Massey out of Senate District 6. Thank goodness that horrible piece of legislation ended up not getting passed, but it does serve as a wonderful example of the type of Republicans serving in elected office or even running for elected office that are supported by the good old boy cowards headed up by Mr. Scott Golden and his little minions on the SEC, as well as those serving in leadership positions in the county Republican Party organizations. Well, that's all the time we have for this week, folks. In next week's segment on liberty, we'll discuss how the so-called Republicans in our General Assembly refuse to protect one of our most basic God-given rights, the right of self-defense. So stay tuned for the closing of the show with God's Word right after this short break. Well, folks, that's a wrap for this week. If you're watching the show on Rumble or YouTube, please give the episode a thumbs up. You could also give it a review if you listen in on Apple or Spotify. Those actions really help the algorithm and make the show more visible on those platforms. Also, please give the Facebook pages of Larry Linton for TN12 and Liberty Leadership and Lives with Larry Linton a follow. Additionally, you can subscribe to the blog on my website of libertyleadershipandlies.com. If you're so inclined and you find it within your means, you can chip into my election campaign. Even $5 would help. The website's landing page is my campaign page where you can find out more about me and why I'm running. This week's wisdom from God's Word comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 15. Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. The cowards and liars in our Tennessee General Assembly that proclaim themselves to be Republicans, but propose legislation that is no different than anything the liberty-robbing communists would propose, or they vote on legislation in committee or on the floor of the House or Senate in a manner that is completely consistent with how the communists vote, they are lying to all Tennesseans that we have a Republican supermajority here in the volunteer state. The liars and cowards that run the Tennessee GOP, that they only force their bylaws to protect the incumbents that claim to be Republican, or don't enforce those same bylaws to push establishment Republicans over the finish line in primary races, they are the ravening wolves of communism, eating our liberty with the ferocity that can only come from weak and timid men whose authority has been challenged. I have chosen to take a stand in the arena against these liars that would see our beloved state of Tennessee turn into one of the communist blue state hellholes rather than relinquish one bit of power and control over the levers of government. I close this episode with the humble plea that you all, especially the residents of Tennessee House District 12, take a stand in that arena with me so that we can keep Tennessee free with a government that does its part of staying out of our wallets and also starts standing in the gap between an ever growing tyrannical government in Washington, D.C. I'm asking that you all join with me in taking this stand so that we can restore our state and our nation back to their foundational principles of individual liberty and small government. Until next week, reveille. It's time to wake up.